me describe a game to you. You play a silent customizable fighter, you explore a crumbling, vaguely gothic world with no map markers, you rest at a glowing checkpoint that heals you completely and undoes all your progress on every enemy you just killed. You die constantly and somehow every death feels like your fault, but you still proceed, evolve and progress, and somehow every death makes you stronger. And eventually you finally beat the boss and you feel like you're on top of the world. Am I describing Dark Souls? Sure. Am I describing Elden Ring? Absolutely, but at this point I am describing a farming game, a monster taming game, and at least a dozen other games that share almost nothing with Dark Souls, beyond one glowing checkpoint. That's the video, somewhere between Dark Souls becoming one of the most influential games of the last 15 years and right now Souls-like stopped being a genre and started being a marketing sticker. Everything must be a Souls-like or come out with that tag, and many of them are not even doing it right, while some of them nail it right out of the bat. That's what I'm going to discuss today. Before we start, I love this genre, it's actually my favorite one. This isn't a Souls-like or bad video, it's more of an emphasis on what things are being done wrong and the mass production of games in this genre. So let's start at the actual beginning, because to understand how we end up with a Pokemon adjacent Souls-like in 2026, yes, that's real, we are absolutely getting there. You need to understand how genuinely unlike this whole genre was to exist in the first place. Before any of this, FromSoftware was not a big deal. They were a mid-tier at best Japanese studio mostly known for King's Field, which was a stiff first-person dungeon crawler series that maybe only a few thousand people outside of Japan even knew about it, and even less touched that game. And Armored Core, a mech combat series with a few small but devoted fan base. Now let's meet the guy this entire genre gets talked about through. Hidetaka Miyazaki did not grow up dreaming of directing video games. He studied social science at Keio University, graduated and took a job as an account manager at Oracle, partly to help pay for his sister's college tuition. A normal man and a completely normal, stable, forgettable corporate job. Then a friend of him recommended him to try out PlayStation 2 game called Echo, and that was apparently it. How one game rewired something in his brain. In his late 20s, with zero industry experience, he decided he wanted to make games instead of selling software license. Here is the part nobody talks about. Nobody hired him. He was 29 years old and in Japan in the mid-2000s. Changing your entire career at that age is considered borderline reckless. There was only one company willing to take a chance on him. From an ex-Oracle guy with social science degree and no portfolio whatsoever, FromSoftware took him in. He started in 2004, not as a visionary director, but as a planner, joining Armored Core Last Raven partway through its development. He put his head down, learned the craft from the ground up, and eventually got to direct Armored Core 4 and its sequel. Respectable work, but nothing that would make you call him the director. Then he heard about a different project falling apart somewhere else in the same building, a fantasy action RPG that had been in development for a while, that the people above him already considered a failure. No compelling prototype, no real identity, that kind of project that gets cancelled and nobody even bothers to remember. Miyazaki asked to take it over. His own explanation for why it's almost too perfect. If he had good ideas, this dying project was the perfect vessel to try them on. Because if they failed, nothing would actually be lost. Nobody would be upset if it got worse. He had nothing to lose, and it turns out a lot of specific opinions about what a fantasy game should feel like. That project became Demon's Souls. He rebuilt everything: slow, deliberate, punishing combat, a genuinely oppressive sense of dread, and the best part, no hand-holding whatsoever. No quest markers, no tutorial pop-ups walking you through every single mechanic. You just woke up in a place called the Nexus and the game more or less said, figure it out. And if you died, you didn't lose progress, you came back as a weaker, more fragile version of yourself. By the standards of game design present in 2008 and 2009, this was an insane pitch. And the industry told him right away. When Demon's Souls was revealed at the Tokyo Game Show in 2009, it landed badly. The reception was cold, and the initial sales were underwhelming, enough that Miyazaki on account, the game was built to flop. Sony's own European division looked at the game and said on the record they had no plans to publish it in Europe at all. Atlus, who picked up the North America rights, wasn't exactly betting on the company either. Their original sales were estimated to be around 70,000 copies in total, and the first shipment was only around 50,000 units. That's not confidence, that's a company putting bets on a game that they weren't sure that the audience wanted. Then something happened that no marketing budget can manufacture: word of mouth. Slowly, then all at once, the people who did buy Demon's Souls could not stop talking about it. Sales in Japan started rising. Atlus North America release ended up tripling their own sales estimates within months, and eventually got reprinted as a discount Great Edition version because the demand kept climbing well past what anyone had ever planned. And Europe is the wildest part of this whole history, because for a year after the Japan release there was no official way to buy this game anywhere in Europe. Eventually, Bandai Namco, after almost a year in 2010, decided they wanted to publish it there. On the year that the game wasn't present there, people kept importing copies from other territories. Imagine that. That game that would go on to define an entire decade of game design almost didn't get an official release in Europe at all. Demon's Souls became a cult hit, critically adored and a genuine commercial surprise. But here's the catch: greedy ass Sony owned the Demon's Souls name and the IP outright. So when FromSoftware wanted to build on what they started, they couldn't just jump to make Demon's Souls 2. They had to rebuild everything from scratch, one that could be published across multiple platforms instead of being locked to a single console. This new property was Dark Souls, released in 2011 and published by Bandai Namco, and once again directed by Miyazaki itself. It took everything Demon's Souls proves that it could work and expanded it. A single interconnected world where areas loop back into each other in ways level designers still write essays about. It kept the punishing combat, kept the figure it out approach, and introduced the bonfire system that would become biggest recognizable image of the genre. And this is the point where it begins being an actual cultural moment. You died, turned into a meme. Get good became an entire attitude towards difficult games. Dark Souls didn't just sell well, it became the thing every other hard game got compared to. Critics started calling it one of the greatest games ever made. And for once, this was not IGN doing for clicks. One man created a genre that defines our current generation and that it will probably define the generations still to come, pushing against mainstream game design, and somehow it worked out. From there, Miyazaki got promoted to the president from FromSoftware in 2014 off the strength of Dark Souls, a jump that is never heard about on the standards of Japanese corporate career path. Then Bloodborne arrived in 2015 with Sony asking them to build something new for their brand new console generation. This game immediately broke their own house rules and stripped away shields almost entirely and swapping them for firearms. Speeding up the combat, being the opposite of Dark Souls' slow, patient chess match. We don't talk about Dark Souls 2, I don't care. Then there is Dark Souls 3 to close out the trilogy back in 2016. With Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, throwing a stamina-based dodging altogether in favor of posture and parry system in 2019. And in the end, taking Game of the Year on that same year. Why did I talk about all of this? Because I want to point out that FromSoftware never treated Soulsborne games as a fixed recipe. Miyazaki even said once upon a time that difficulty was never really the point on its own actual goal. The actual goal was actually giving players a genuine sense of having earned something, by making that function as a teacher instead of a punishment. Every game on that list changes the actual rules of what a Souls game is supposed to be, sometimes drastically, while keeping that underlying idea intact. Keep that distinction in your back pocket, because it's going to matter a lot once we get into the flood of games that have copied the rules and skipped the ideas. I also want to talk about the creativity from Miyazaki, because he came from a rough childhood where he didn't have much money for books, so he started borrowing English language fantasy novels from the library. Why is this important? Because I want to picture an idea to you. He didn't have the full understanding of the English language back then, so he used the illustrations to fill in the gaps with its own imagination, and that is exactly how item descriptions work in a Dark Souls game, or in a Souls game. And the multiplayer, the bloodstains, the messages from the strangers, that specific feeling of being helped by someone you never actually met before, traces back to a memory of him being stuck on the icy road, I'm not kidding, and watching strangers get out of their own cars to push each other free, without properly introducing themselves, and then just driving off into the sunset without any knowledge of how their lives went or where they were going. And that's an important difference between a founder and a cheap imitator copying the surface of it. Before we start talking about oversaturation, let's actually define what a Souls-like really is. Stamina gate combat, where attacking, blocking and dodging all cost a resource, so you cannot physically just button mash your way through. A deliberate, punishing but fair difficult curve, where dying is common but is supposed to feel like your mistake, not a game cheating you. Checkpoint hubs, that being bonfires, lanterns or whatever the game wants to call them, that heal you completely but also respawn every regular enemy you just cleared. A currency tied to your levers and gears that you drop on death, that can be reclaimed exactly once if you can fight your way back to your own corpse. Interconnected, atmospheric world design that rewards memorizing and exploration over following a checkpoint or a waypoint. Storytelling, sometimes, only sometimes, delivered through item descriptions, environment or cryptic side characters, instead of long cutscenes explaining everything to you. And boss fighters that get treated as an actual main content, not a speed bump between story beats. That's a good definition to follow in general, even if sometimes it deviates from that point, so we cannot follow it to the teeth. The first part I want to talk about is how the gaming media talks about Soul-likes, because the words quietly stop meaning what it's actually meant to mean. You don't believe me? Dark Souls is a Soulsborne because it comes from software. Okay, Lies of P is a Souls-like because it has checkpoints and works with a parry-based system and hard bosses. Okay, fine for now. Let's go even further. So by that follow-up, then Hollow Knight and Blasphemous must be also a Souls-like. That's what IGN says, so it must be truth, right? So God of War must also be a Souls-like, of course. So Nioh is also a Souls-like, not a fast-paced looter action game. No. So Control must be also a Souls-like. Critic storytelling, resourcing tracking, and checkpoints boots, right? So Silent Hill F is also a Souls-like because it has dodges, it has dodges, it has boss fights, it has checkpoints, so it must be a Souls-like also. So Barbie is a Souls-like because it has to go against GTA 6 and that's a hard fight. So the belly of Queso is a Souls-like because it has a bonfire of hair there. So 2 towers falling must be a Souls-like. Not those towers that you guys are thinking about. You're taking this way too far, but yes, those ones. Because they didn't dodge in time, so that must be one. So your father getting milk and not coming back is a Souls-like because he dodged the responsibility of raising you. Okay, I'm done. Outlets more and more have called Metrovania Souls-like because of their tough bosses, even if that is further from the truth. Star Wars, Jedi Fallen Order and Survivor got Souls-like combat written directly into their own marketing for having a parry button and respawning checkpoints. Remnant from the Ashes leaned into that label itself, branding itself as a co-op third-person shooter as a Souls-like, mainly because dying meant you were back in the hub. Which by that standard, every single game from the 80s is a Souls-like. Everything is Souls-like. There is also the recurring pattern of outlets just looking at older games and being, this is the real inventor of Souls-like, years before Demon's Souls ever existed. This year, the coverage tied to the new Onimusha revival made exactly that same case for the 2001 original, a hack and slash game that predates Demon's Souls by 8 years. Whether or not that argument holds up, it says something about how loosely the terms get thrown around nowadays. This isn't a new problem for genres either. Roguelike used to mean something specific, for example procedural generated dungeons, permadeath and turn-based combat, directly from a game called Rogue, back in the 80s. Now it gets applied to almost anything with a randomized run and permadeath feature, to the point the term roguelite had to be invented, just to claw back some precision. Metrovania is drifting in the same way. It used to mean something like a specific style of interconnected maps with ability-gated backtracking, and now it's just a game that lets you backtrack at all. The label matters because it sets expectations. Someone who buys a game expects stamina management, checkpoint tension, and punishing but fair difficult curve. Because the marketing said it was a Souls-like, and instead of that, someone gets one hard boss fight after another, it's going to feel misled, even if the game itself is perfectly good at what it's actually trying to do. When a general label turns into a marketing sticker instead of an actual design philosophy, it stops telling you anything useful before you spend $60. That's the real setup for the actual problem. Now let's talk about the flood.
Winner is Elden Ring!
Every time one game wins Game of the Year, something weird happens. In this case, what it means to the gaming industry. When Last of Us Part 1 won, it created a bunch of cinema kids trying to replicate that without the same degree of precision or an interesting story behind it. And the same thing happened to Elden Ring. Elden Ring didn't just sell well, it sold tens of millions of copies, swept nearly every single Game of the Year ceremony that existed, and turned the next Dark Souls into a phrase publishers now say out loud in pitch meetings with a complete straight face. When a genre produces a hit that size, every publisher looks at their own back catalog and asks the same question: can we do that to our own franchises? So let's just take a look at the amount of games actually out and still to come just in 2025 and 2026, because that list alone makes the point better than I can explain. We got the first Berserker Kazan and Wuchang Fallen Feathers, both landed in 2025. Elden Ring Night Rain from FromSoftware own multiplayer spin-off arrived in the exact same year. Then in 2026 alone we had Code Vein 2, Neo 3 and an actual sequel to the Lords of the Fallen. A new Onimusha that the wave of retrospective claims that the original was the starter of this genre, an extraction shooter meets Souls-like hybrid with a cash shop attached to it called Mistfall Hunters, a first-person sword and pistol called Valor Mortis, another first-person one called Fate Keeper, a game called Very Horn, a free-to-play Souls-like called Ballad of Antara, Mortal Shell 2, Beast of Reincarnation, which I will talk later, and Miyazaki own next project, The Duskbloods, a vampire-themed PvP and PvE game that's a Switch 2 exclusive. That's an absurd amount of games chasing the same design language inside the same 18-month window. And I haven't mentioned Phantom Blade Zero, that isn't a Souls-like but gets treated like one. I'm not going to say this name wrong, I'm sorry. Another Chinese historical action RPG that gets also the same label, and that's before you scroll past a dozens of smaller low-budget entries that quietly bolt a stamina bar and a checkpoint onto wherever they were already building. Because right now Souls-likes are the hottest single thing on this whole list, and one ticket to the top to be taken seriously on the store page. Here is the problem presented in front of us. Not just, wow, that's a lot of games. When a genre turns into a checklist instead of a design philosophy, we are in big trouble, and the end results turn out as a feeling of like an empty game in general. Bonfires get reskinned with a brand new game, Souls become some other made-up currency with a fantasy name, you still explore a corridor, you still hit a checkpoint, and eventually fight a big guy with a glowing weak point, as a pile of games that can be exhausting, to say the least. Wuchang Fallen Feathers is actually a great example of this, because it's not a bad game. Reviewers genuinely like them, I have my caveats with it, but it's not a bad game. It's praised on how genuinely gorgeous it looks, it's praised for some of the creative ideas built into that, but review after review, rated independently of each other, landed on the exact same conclusion: solid, well made, but forgettable in the end of the day. In a genre so crowded, it's genuinely hard or difficult for a new entry to stand out, no matter how good the game is. And that's not me being harsh, other reviewers actually pointed this out. It's a crowded room, it's hard, and that's the real cost of oversaturation. Player fatigue, not these games are bad, most of them genuinely aren't, but I can't tell these apart from the thriller anymore. I have already a backlog of 40 games, so this one is going on the wish list to quietly die. When everything promises the same brutal but fair difficult curve and the same moody high fantasy or historical atmosphere, the ones that are actually good get buried under the ones that are merely fine. Good games starve next to competent ones in a flooded market, because attention, unlike a bonfire, does not respawn. And it's not only the smaller studios feeling this. Even FromSoftware, the actual originators of this whole genre, released Elden Ring Night Rain in 2025 to what became their worst Steam standing of any full game, with most complaints aimed at the missing multiplayer features rather than the core idea being broken. Night Rain still pulled an enormous amount of concurrent player counts, and it's still an amazing game, where I have over 100 hours on, but it still doesn't feel like a real experience of what a Souls-like should be. So the Flood doesn't just risk drowning the weaker entries, it quietly raises the bar for everyone, a bar they have to clear, including the studio that created that genre. Let's now talk about what type of Souls-likes exist out there, the good, the bad, the mid, because some Souls-likes are good and some aren't, just doesn't clear the bar. It is a useless sentence without any actual examples. So here's a handful of examples that landed well or landed not so well. Lies of P is the easiest. This is how you do it example. On paper, it is a extremely by the numbers, stamina bar, checkpoints, big bosses, cryptic item lore, but it built an entire world identity on top of that skeleton, a Pinocchio story at its core, that turned soured with a modular prosthetic arm system that changes how you approach each fight, and a specific gothic clockwork city that doesn't feel or look like Lodron or Yarnan. It borrowed the grammar and it still wrote its own sentence. The game pairing feels different from Sekiro and it has its own identity attached to it. That is how the game should be built and how it should feel. Let's talk about something that released recently, that being Beast of Reincarnation, that sits perfectly in the middle. In my opinion, it's just an alright game. I have been playing it for the last couple of days, but every time I play it, I feel like IGN got it right for the first time. Because the game game is just mid. If you compare it to any other game, it fails or lacks in something. You go for the story, it's interesting world, but the cutscenes take so long and sometimes so unnecessary. There is no soul behind any of the characters, the voice acting looks like AI slop, and it's just forgettable overall. You go for the combat and it's nothing new. By the end, you rather be playing Sekiro in general. There is that certain feeling that I can't really point out, but the parry system, it's there, but it's not really refined. I can feel it. Maybe it's the DLSS of FSR with the input lag, but after deactivating it, it's still there, something missing. It's not as satisfying as it should be. I can feel that something is wrong there in terms of the tracking of the parry. It fails sometimes at its own job. If you fail something or block something, you are still dead either way. Also, the posture bar works similar to Neo 3, even if Neo 3 is stamina based, and there lies a problem. In Neo 3, if you get hit there without stamina, there is still a chance that you can recover from that. In this game, no. The camera is the worst thing about this game. The tracking is so bad. There is a new mechanic of the dog that is similar to something you would see in Final Fantasy VII, but it's nothing new, nothing major. I don't have any problems with it, but people will point out that it slows down the combat, and they are right, and that might be an issue for you. There is no enemy variety, not at the start, not in the middle, not in the end, and reusable boss fights that shouldn't be in the game that it's that pricey to begin with. You are better off buying Stellar Blade because it's better in every shape or form, even if I think the story of Stellar Blade lags a little bit behind, or Lies of P. Maybe you waste more money, but they are often in discount, so why not? If you take Mortal Shell 2 demo, you will have more enemy variety there than there is on this whole game. Incredible. And if there is the same enemy, it will be the same attack pattern, so the game gets easier. The difficulty on hard is so artificial, you will still die to a level 1 enemy either way, even if you are all the way leveled up. We can go for the graphics, well, it's pretty, but art direction will always take the cake for me. Not saying that there isn't any sort of art direction on this game and the game isn't pretty, but it's Unreal Engine 5. If you put that side to side with other games that use that exact same engine, you will feel like nothing changed in terms of the lighting. And also, if you are considering buying the game because of the graphics, you are already entering this game on the wrong foot. Optimization is fine, at least for me, and of course the exploration that is lackluster in general. It will be, open this box, open that box, there is an elite enemy over there, there is another enemy over there, maybe a stronghold somewhere underground. It's just a mid game in general, nothing you haven't seen before and nothing that it will not show up in another game, but better realized or better implemented. And then there is the example that proves part 2 whole argument all over again, Black Myth Wukong. It shows up constantly on the best Soul-like lists, gorgeous, built on the classic novel Journey to the West and home to some genuinely spectacular boss fights. Except plenty of players and critics will tell you with total confidence that isn't really a Souls-like at all. That's more of a linear, more traditional story-driven action RPG with a noticeable, gentle death penalty. It's an amazing game, but it's nowhere near a Souls-like or even closer, making that label feel loose or just that the label is being applied to everything. Neo, now 3 entries deep, is exactly what happens when the studio spends over a decade refining its own specific spin instead of chasing FromSoftware one-to-one. Stance switching, loot chasing, a genuinely different combat rhythm that its fans will argue it's more fun minute to minute than the games that inspired it. Neo 3 landed to some of the best reviews the series has ever received, and still gets compared to Souls-like either way, even if it's not one. On the rougher end, Lords of the Fallen 2023 reboot had a genuinely clever hook, a dual realm system letting you peer into a parallel realm of the dead in real time. Reviewers like that idea a lot, but the execution shipped loaded with bugs, a rocky launch, enough to need months of patches, and a difficulty philosophy that leaned on throwing more enemies at the player instead of designing smarter ones. This was a game that did not understand the lessons of the genre that it was copying. It's not a bad game, but now it's a good game because it finally got the patches it needed to work. Wuchang Fallen Feathers, the same one from a few minutes ago, belongs here too. It's a clearest example of competent but interchangeable. It's a gorgeous world with some genuinely interesting ideas with the madness mechanic, but in the end of the day, it will be forgotten within a week. And then there is the wildcard, Elden Ring Night Rain, which proves oversaturation cuts in both directions. It's not a lazy clone, it's FromSoftware actively trying not to repeat itself, bottling a roguelite battle royale adjacent structure onto their own formula, and still got rejected by a big part of the Soul audience because it wasn't more of that exact thing they came for. Sometimes the problem isn't a studio copying the formula too closely, sometimes it's an audience so saturated with the formula that they have grown suspicious of anything that deviates from it too. Put all of these side to side and the actual lesson isn't innovate or stick to the formula, it's that the checklist was never really the point. Every good Souls-like on that list uses roughly the same list of ingredients as every mediocre one. The difference is always whether it was special in some sort of way, if it has a reason to exist in the first place beyond people like Dark Souls. So where does this actually go? Realistically, nowhere, in the sense that this genre is not dying. Elden Ring alone guarantees FromSoftware keeps making these games for another decade. Miyazaki is still actively experimenting instead of coasting on a formula, which is more than you can say about most directors 20 years into a hit franchise. And the sheer commercial gravity of this genre means publishers are not going to stop greenlighting Souls-likes just because one guy on YouTube that plays the games thinks they are too many of them. What probably happens instead is what happens on every saturated genre eventually. The good ones stay, the bad ones disappear. Not through some industry-wide intervention, just through players getting pickier, forgettable entries, quietly getting made for smaller and smaller audience until publishers notice. While the genuinely distinct ones, the Lies of P, the Kazans, wherever comes next that actually has something to say, keeps cutting through it anyways. We have watched this exact cycle before, just a different scenery. Battle royales in this case flooded the market for a couple of years until there were only a handful of them. Hero shooters did almost the exact same thing after Overwatch blowing up. The sheer amount of Souls-like isn't a brand new phenomenon unique to this genre, it's just a decade version of a pattern the industry repeats every time one game gets too big to ignore. So here's the actual question I will leave you with, since it's my opinion video or an emphasis of how many are being produced and not a Souls-like are bad. What's actually earning your 60 hours right now? A bonfire and a stamina bar, or a reason you will still remember the game a year from now? Because at this point one of those is rare on this industry. Drop your favorite Souls-likes in the comments and your least favorite one. I want to hear your real hot takes, not safe ones. And if you think I got anything wrong on this video, genuinely tell me. Half of the research of this video was people trying to convince me that Sekiro doesn't count as a Souls-like. Like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Love ya. Bye.